As a kid, I really enjoyed playing Monopoly with my family. Rounds can be quite long, but it made for some really enjoyable game nights when I was young. My family liked it because it would make for a quality, active social experience, and I liked it because I knew the secret to beating the game and would win almost every single time. I was an achiever as a kid. I was determined to find a way to win, even if it meant bending the rules a little bit to get there. When playing the dice-based poker game Yahtzee, for example, my dad would grant me as many bonus rolls as I desired to make me feel like I won. As I got older, however, I learned that Yahtzee is ultimately just a game of chance where the luckiest player ends up being the winner. So we stopped playing that game. Another game I played a lot as a kid with my dad was Stratego. It's a game of capture the flag in which players set up the perfect arrangement of soldiers and traps to enable them to charge into enemy territory and find the flag as efficiently as possible while also having a formidable defense on their end. After a weekend of being trapped indoors by vicious rain, however, we got bored of the game and eventually stopped playing. In Stratego, soldiers are numbered from 1 to 9, with 9 being the weakest and 1 being the strongest. Marshal, General, Colonel, Major, Captain, Lieutenant, Sergeant, Minor, Scout. In addition to the soldiers, there's a spy who can defeat the Marshal, bombs which can't move but defeat everyone but the miners, and the flag itself. The numbers actually go the opposite way in the original set, with the spy as piece 1 and the Marshal as piece 10, but later editions reversed it for one reason or another. Logically, players will want to put the flag as far away from their opponent as possible, as this provides the largest soldier buffer between the enemy and the goal. While the 2 lakes on the board may lead some to believe that the flag could be hidden there, it's an incredibly risky strategy that typically doesn't work, as the flag has to be exposed. With the flag hidden in a back corner, the next logical thing would be to protect it. The Marshal could be placed back there, but that only protects one side of the flag and will gimp your offense. The spy could be placed back there, but it's useless unless the enemy is using their Marshal, and every other soldier could be easily eliminated by the Marshal or a similar high-ranking piece. As such, the best defense for the flag is as follows. Place 3 bombs in a diagonal with the 1 space gap between them and the flag in the corner. Then place 2 sergeants right behind those bombs. This forces the opponent to make at least 2 individual trips before getting to the flag, as they need to bring a minor to remove a bomb first, then bring a different piece with the higher rank to eliminate the sergeant. This will take the opponent the most amount of time to get to the flag. It is the optimal setup for the game of Stratego, as no other setup has the potential to be as effective. When playing against someone who doesn't know of this strategy, you're likely to win the game, as your opponent will not be prepared for the bomb sergeant trap when they discover it, and they won't have that trap themselves. There will be variance with how the board is set up outside of that trap and how the game plays out, but this setup will give you the biggest leg up possible. The problem arises when playing against someone who does know of this strategy, as the game reduces itself to a simple game of 50-50 chance. The game becomes a rush to discover which corner the opponent has hid their flag in, and at that point the game becomes even more repetitive. Throughout that weekend, my dad and I would attempt to optimize our setups even further, only to realize that there wasn't much else to optimize. The best additional strategy we came up with was to mirror the bomb sergeant trap on the opposite corner, with the spy replacing the flag to drag out the false lead, and by extension the game as a whole, as long as possible. Out of new ideas and getting bored of the same tactics over and over again, we decided to look up strategies for the game online, only to discover what we had already learned, that surrounding the flag with bombs and sergeants was the undeniable best way to play the game. This is an example of a dominant strategy, and yes, it applies to Monopoly as well, but it's a little more complicated. The goal of Monopoly is to bankrupt all opponents. In order to do that, players must acquire property across the board and build houses and hotels on said property to raise the rent for the unfortunate souls who happen to land on a space you own. The only way to develop land is to get a namesake monopoly on all property of a particular color, meaning that someone couldn't build on Atlantic Avenue unless they also own Ventnor and Marvin Gardens. What property should players build on? Well, there are a couple of factors at play. First and most important, the board itself. The most important thing to understand about Monopoly is that not all spaces are equal. There are a few select spaces which players are more likely to be on than others due to specific events within the game. Of these spaces, the one with the largest probability is the jail space, as the go to jail space, a card from the Chansey community chest piles, and rolling 3 sets of doubles in a row all send players to jail, not counting players in the just visiting lane. probability for other spaces is largely determined by the chance and community chest cards, as they are the primary tools which send players to specific spaces. Because 2 of these cards can send players to go, players have a relatively high chance of being there. Reading Railroad is similarly affected, as it not only has a chance card which sends players directly to it, but is also affected by the card which sends players to the nearest railroad. Other spaces which are affected by chance and community chest cards are less probable than Reading, but are still notable. The next factor is the dice which are used to move around the board. With a set of 2 6-sided dice, the most likely roll for players to make is a 7, followed by a 6 and 8, then 9 and 5, so on and so forth, with 12 and 2 being the least likely rolls. Finally, the value of building on spaces should be considered. As players move across the board, spaces get more and more expensive, with Mediterranean being the least pricey and Boardwalk being the most pricey. In addition, building houses becomes more and more expensive, with the first side's houses only costing $50 and the fourth side's houses costing a whopping $200. So what do all of these factors mean? Well, if jail is the most visited space on the board, then the spaces after jail are also frequently visited. As such, the orange lot is incredibly valuable, as it is the most likely region for players to land after the jail space. The light blue lot is also valuable, as it is the most likely region for players to land after go. The blue lot actually loses value, as despite being pricey, it immediately follows the go to jail space and has none of the previously identified key spaces preceding it. The dark lot, brown or purple depending on version, is unsurprisingly the least useful of the bunch. The orange, light blue, and yellow lots also have a second advantage, a greater accrued property value. Houses cost the same to build on any particular side of a board, but the values of properties along that side are ever increasing. As such, the cost of a house means more to properties with a higher initial value than properties with a lower initial value. The initial cost differential between St. Charles Place and New York Avenue, for example, is $60. Building a single house on each already will net back half the difference once a single player lands on New York. If a hotel is built, the return on investment is $250 greater at the very least. This is before taking into account the advantage New York already has over St. Charles in terms of being landed on more often. St. Charles is still moderately useful given its placement after Reading, but its value is monumentally less than New York. To sum up, players with the orange lot will have a massive leg up over other players, with the yellow, red, pink, and light blue lots also being useful in that order. According to the official Monopoly manual, obtaining property is less a game of luck than it is a game of strategy. If a player lands on an unowned property, then that player can buy it. If the player chooses not to buy it, the property goes out for auction, in which the banker sells the property to the highest bidder. In addition, any undeveloped properties can be sold to a player in a private transaction. This means that it is incredibly unlikely for a player to obtain a full set through sheer luck. Instead, players will have to negotiate to get the set they want. Now, the dilemma becomes fairly similar to our Stratego example. When playing against opponents who don't know which properties give them the biggest advantage, then you're likely to win so long as you buy enough railroads, utilities, and other useless properties to sell off to unsuspecting opponents. But when playing against opponents who do know which properties give them the biggest advantage, the game becomes far less interesting as a result. Players merely roll the dice and hope they land on more useful properties than the opponents and try to scoop up as many as possible. Trading becomes less common because of the known higher stakes, and the game slows down to a crawl. Ultimately, the end of the game will come about due to a few unlucky rolls rather than the execution of any well thought out plan. The catch is, however, that this is merely one half of the real dominant strategy of Monopoly. After all, buying property is only part of the game. Once players own a full set, they are encouraged to develop on it. So how should players develop once they have a full set? Simple. Referring back to the rules of the game, you may, at any time during your turn, buy and build as many houses as your judgment and financial standing will allow in accordance with the above rules. You must, however, build evenly. You cannot build more than one house on any property of a color group until you have built one house on every property of that color group. This rule is in place to prevent an exploit. Players cannot deliberately build up houses on a single property and hope that opponents have a single unlucky roll. This would mean that a poorer player with less money to spend could theoretically bankrupt a richer player out of sheer luck. The rules continue. If the bank has no more houses to sell, players wishing to build must wait for another player to return or sell houses back to the bank before they can build. This means that, unlike the limited amount of money the rules enforce, houses are a limited commodity. Once they're gone, they're gone. The only way for more houses to enter the pool is for a player to either sell a house or upgrade a set of 4 houses to a hotel. If neither of these things happen, however, all players are locked out of developing property any further. There's no way around this either. If a player has 3 houses on all properties, they cannot merely upgrade to hotels, as you must have 4 houses on each property of a complete color group before you can buy a hotel. As such, the true dominant strategy of Monopoly is to follow through with the game's title and monopolize the housing market. Buy as many houses as humanly possible without ever upgrading to hotels, and prevent opponents from developing on their property at all. Doing this practically ensures victory, and doing this on an advantageous set only speeds up that victory. But, once again, a problem arises. When playing against opponents who know this strategy, the game becomes far less exciting. After the already tedious slog associated with getting a single set of useful properties, the game slows down even more once that house well runs dry. No player will upgrade to a hotel, no player will sell a house, and no player will trade a property. As such, the only deciding factor in the entire game at that point is the dice. Monopoly turns entirely into a game of luck. Just like the simpler Stratego example, understanding how to play Monopoly effectively has ruined Monopoly. But there's a difference between Stratego and Monopoly. Stratego is a broken game, but Monopoly is an intentionally broken game. Ladies and gentlemen, this video is about to get political. Before being sold to Parker Brothers, Monopoly wasn't actually called Monopoly. Instead, it was called The Landlord's Game. It was developed by Elizabeth Magie not as a form of entertainment, but as an educational tool. Monopoly, or at least its predecessor, is one of the greatest and first examples of gaming being used as a platform for something more than pure entertainment. See, The Landlord's Game is a game about Georgism, an early socialist progressive economic theory which argues that natural resources and other economic valuables which come from the earth should belong to all members of society equally. Georgists, or geoists in some circles, argue that when people have to pay a price for walking on a piece of land or drinking water from a particular well, the person who controls the land, the 1%, will get all of the money and power, leaving the 99% to less than ideal economic circumstances. The reason why the game was made was to try to explain these ideas and concepts to commoners who don't understand complex economic principles. Players would play out a property trading game and witness firsthand all of the consequences that enabling players to own land would allow for. The game spread across the United States East Coast, and a number of people came up with their own variants of the game, but with every new version made, the original intent of the game was made less and less important. Slowly, the game morphed into something which people could get together and enjoy. The Landlord's Game was a biting critique of capitalist society. Monopoly was the exact opposite, the commercialization of owning property and exploiting your opponents. Ultimately, however, the original Georgist morals embedded within the Landlord's Game still exist in Monopoly. Just as oil companies desperately rush to find the best locations to strip the earth of its natural resources and maximize profit, players in Monopoly desperately rush to find the best properties to develop on and, well, maximize profit. Just as multinational corporations continue to acquire smaller companies with the ultimate goal of outbuying their competition, players in Monopoly purchase houses from a limited supply with the goal of outbuying their competition. Or how about that tedious slog of a waiting game that happens when all of the houses are depleted? It's a slog because players don't want to make any bold moves on their opponents. If one player builds up to a hotel to try and get some extra rent or to create more houses for them to use, the opponent could just as easily use that move to their advantage. Could that principle not also apply to something like the nuclear arms race, or net neutrality, or gas prices, or a whole slew of other topics? These wide-reaching socio-political issues can be difficult to process, let alone explain to other people, but thankfully, this intentionally broken game still exists, and we can still learn from it and apply it to the world we live in today. Now, Magie originally patented the Landlord's Game in 1904, but she continued to develop the game over the course of the next 30 or so years. The final version of her game, released just 2 years before the Monopoly we know today was pitched to Parker Brothers, had a notable addition, a second rule set called Prosperity. The idea behind this version of the game was to teach people the Georgist solution to the monopolization issue. If players got frustrated with the experience, they could vote to change the game to prosperity rules, where land rent went to a public treasury and most trespassing fees were entirely ignored. The manual reads, "Do you want to be wealthy? Play the Landlord's Game and learn how. Do you want prosperity? Play the prosperity game and find out." It's quite simple. The first rule set is the problem, the second rule set is the solution. But when Monopoly was distributed by Parker Brothers, prosperity was entirely lost, and the intentionally broken game was shipped out to the masses and played by families everywhere with the solution missing. But wait, there's something we're missing in this whole conversation. The forced auction rule, the one house at a time rule, many people don't enforce them in games of Monopoly at all. In addition, a large number of house rules have become commonplace amongst modern-day Monopoly players. House rules exist in many games, but no house rules are as common as those which have altered the way people play Monopoly. The interesting thing about these house rules is that they end up fixing a number of the problems that we have been talking about. One house rule has all players move around the entire board one time before purchasing any property. This rule serves to further randomize the properties players initially land on and buy. Instead of most players landing close to 8 spaces from go in the light blue region, followed by 8 or so spaces from there near St. James, so on and so forth, players become likelier to land on a more diverse set of properties and spaces on their first revolution around the board. Another rule has to do with free parking. The official rules of the game state that this space serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever, but there is a fairly common house rule which turns free parking into a bit of a lottery. All taxes and fees which normally go to the bank instead go to free parking, and when a player lands on the free parking space, the full pot goes to that player. The lottery reverts back to zero and the process then repeats. The purpose of this rule is to provide a sort of charity for players who maybe aren't doing as well in the game. Instead of a failing player's only income coming from go and the negligible rent from the few properties they own, they have the opportunity to make a monetary comeback through the free parking lottery. There are a number of other house rules with similar intentions, such as landing on go netting a double salary and rolling snake eyes netting a free $500 from the bank. House rules like these genuinely make the game more enjoyable for players because they provide an opportunity for all players to succeed, and not just the ones who know the one optimal strategy. The house rules of the game turn Monopoly into something resembling prosperity. Perhaps the most widely adopted house rule is the removal of the forced auction. Many Monopoly purists argue that this rule does nothing but slow the game down, but it also serves a second purpose. The forced auction can start at any price according to the official rules, meaning that if some player doesn't want an incredibly valuable property, an opponent can scoop it up for as little as a single Monopoly dollar bill. This incentivizes players to buy things for far lower than they are actually worth, leading to larger profits and less risk. Eliminating this rule forces players to both land on the space and pay the appropriate price in order to obtain the property. It also forces players to consider the value of the space and whether or not it's worth the cost. Railroads and utilities, maybe those aren't worth the value. Maybe, in the micro-universe of Monopoly, things like transportation and public needs should be run by the government instead of the public sector. Or how about the incredibly radical change to the game which ignores colors entirely? Instead of having to build a monopoly out of a color group, this rule enables players to develop on individual properties and reap the profits of their labor that way instead. This house rule almost entirely solves the advantages that certain color groups had over others and evens the playing field in a massive way. If that variant of the game is more fun, then maybe it's because small business is better and more fair than big business. Maybe a select few corporations monopolizing a number of industries cuts out the little guys and serves to reduce jobs and hurt the middle class. Maybe those politics aren't the most agreeable, and maybe those radical variants of Monopoly aren't the most agreeable either. But that doesn't matter, because regardless of what rules you play by or what beliefs you follow, the existence of these rule variants and the discussions associated prove that, against all odds, Elizabeth Maggie's original purpose behind the Landlord's game lives on. Do you want to be wealthy? Play Monopoly and learn how. Do you want prosperity? Play by your own rules. Play the prosperity game and find out. Seven. Okay, chance card. You've been elected chairman of the board. Pay each player $50. That sucks. Thank you so much for watching this video about Monopoly. I hope you enjoyed it. I make videos kind of like this, although I've never made something about a board game before. I do media analysis, and media can really be anything, and I'm sort of trying to expand my definition of what media is so that way I can kind of encompass more things. Because media isn't just, music or movies or TV shows or video games. It could be anything. It could be social media. It could be news. It could be board games. This credits bit, while the credits are going on this side of the screen, I want want to thank everyone on this side of the screen. They're all amazing. They all helped me make this video. It's great. I use this time generally to sort of promote some other things that I'm doing, give you some other videos to watch, that kind of business. So 2 things before I get to those other videos. The first thing is that if you didn't know, I have a Patreon account. I'm not really good at this whole self-promo kind of business, especially when it involves monetary transactions. It's sort of a place that you can go if you want to pledge monetarily on a monthly basis to the channel, give some financial support. I can upgrade some equipment. It'd be a good time because I've been putting more and more into these videos every time. For this video, for example, I learned motion graphics. So if you want to support the channel monetarily, by no means a requirement, you can do that. If you don't, then you're still getting the videos at the same time as everyone else. The next thing is under here. Well, first off, I'm wearing orange because of the orange properties of Monopoly, and that's all a good time. But under here, is a shirt that I designed, and it's a fun time. It's not a review shirt. It says not a review on the back, which is pretty cool, but you can only get it with not a review on the back if you order it through Spreadshirt. I don't even know whether you saw the back there because I didn't even fully turn around, but it says not a review on the back. You gotta believe me on this now. So if you want to buy a shirt that I made, then that link is in the description. I'm hoping to maybe do that more often because I had a bit of fun with this one. So there's that. And that sort of segues into me plugging other videos because this video is kind of based, this shirt, sorry, is sort of based on a video I made about review ethics. I made it last year. It's still one of my favorite videos that I've ever made. It's basically about how media reviews sort of fundamentally break the laws of journalism. So if you care about reviews in any way, if you claim to make reviews yourself, or you believe you make reviews yourself, or you do make reviews yourself, I don't know why I started with the whole claiming business. Other video I'm going to promote is the last video I made, which is about Queens of the Stone Age. It was about their 2002 album, Songs for the Deaf, and I talk about how the band used radio as a framing device, not only to like transition between the songs with like physically changing the radio station, but also throughout the record in a bunch of other different ways, more subtle ways as well, to kind of tell a more cohesive story than maybe you might think at first. So I'm going to get cracking on the next video. Yeah, so I'm gonna go now. Later. But she continued to develop the game over the course of the next 30. That was a burp that turned into like, I hate myself. It's really the most millennial thing anyone can do. That isn't even that funny. I don't know why I thought that was funny. It's really not.